The laughter echoed against the concrete walls of the precinct, sharp and cutting. Sergeant Dan Cross and Officer Matt Harper stood side by side, smirking, their arms folded as they towered over the seated woman. "You really thought you could pull that off, huh?" Cross chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. Harper leaned in, grinning. "Look at her, acting all high and mighty. Like anyone's gonna believe her over us." Andrea Lawson sat still, her fingers interlocked, her face unreadable. But behind those calm, dark eyes, something flickered. Not fear, not panic. Something far, far more dangerous. The city pulsed outside, a chaotic symphony of honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and the occasional wail of a distant siren. It was just another Monday morning in New York, a city that never truly slept, only paused to reload. Andrea Lawson had no time for the chaos. She moved with purpose, her black heels clicking against the pavement, her suit tailored to perfection. A woman who belonged exactly where she was. The federal courthouse stood before her, a looming monolith of power, wrapped in cold stone and glass. This was her domain. Or at least, it should have been. "Hey, hands up." The command split through the air like a gunshot. Andrea froze. The voice was sharp, forceful, the kind that carried authority and the expectation of immediate obedience. She turned slowly, her pulse steady, her face betraying nothing. Two officers stood before her, Sergeant Dan Cross and Officer Matt Harper. White, mid-40s. One built like an aging linebacker, the other wiry and mean-eyed. Their hands hovered near their holsters, their bodies tense with a readiness that had nothing to do with actual threat assessment. "Ma'am, step away from the bag and put your hands where we can see them." Andrea tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of amusement flickering across her face. And the reason for this? Her voice was cool, controlled. Harper's eyes flicked toward her briefcase, as though it might explode at any second. A black woman in a sharp suit carrying official-looking documents. That was all it took. "You match the description of someone involved in fraudulent federal activity," Cross said, his jaw tightening. Andrea let the words hang for a moment, deliberately, like savoring the absurdity of it. Then, slowly, she exhaled through her nose. "Fraudulent federal activity," she repeated, voice edged with something dangerous. "Let me guess. Black, well-dressed, carrying something more important than a Starbucks cup. That's what makes me a suspect, right?" Cross's expression darkened. "Just cooperate, ma'am." There it was. Not a request, a demand. Andrea's eyes flickered to the courthouse doors. She was minutes away from walking into a case that could shift the balance of power in the city. Instead, she was standing here in broad daylight, being treated like a criminal for daring to exist in the wrong skin. "I don't have time for this," she said evenly. "I work here." Cross didn't blink. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. Because people like him never did. Instead, he reached for his cuffs. "You resist. It's obstruction," Harper added, already moving to flank her. Andrea's lips parted in something that almost resembled a smile. "Obstruction," she mused. "That's cute. And what exactly am I obstructing?" "The fresh air." Cross's patience snapped. The cuffs came out. Andrea didn't flinch. She didn't fight. She gave them nothing. She simply lifted her hands and let it happen. Because she wasn't just playing their game. She was about to flip the whole board. The cold metal of the cuffs pressed against Andrea's wrists, a sharp contrast to the heat of the morning sun beating down on the concrete. She had been through many things in her career, had faced men more powerful and ruthless than the two standing beside her now. But this was something else. It wasn't just an arrest. It was a statement. A performance. And she was meant to play the role they had already written for her. She didn't speak as they led her toward the waiting patrol car. Around them, the city carried on, indifferent to the scene unfolding in front of the courthouse steps. People walked past, some stealing glances, others deliberately looking away. No one interfered. That was the way it always went. Harper opened the door, a satisfied smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. Cross stood close, his grip firm but unnecessary. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't fighting. Andrea stepped into the back seat without a word. The drive was short but heavy with silence. Harper, in the passenger seat, kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, as if expecting her to break, to plead. to give them some kind of reaction. But Andrea sat still, her hands resting in her lap, her expression unreadable. Cross drummed his fingers against the wheel, his jaw tight. He was the type that thrived on control. The moment someone refused to react the way he wanted, irritation crept in. The precinct loomed ahead, another concrete box filled with men who saw themselves as untouchable. Andrea had spent years studying people like them. She had written reports on their methods, dissected their psychology, watched how they twisted rules to fit their own narratives. Now she was inside their system, being processed like anyone else they had deemed insignificant. They led her through the back entrance, away from the main floor. The fluorescent lighting inside was harsh, buzzing faintly overhead. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the kind of institutionalized authority that clung to the walls. At the desk, a bored-looking officer raised an eyebrow as she was brought forward. "Charges?" he asked, not bothering to look up from the screen. Harper answered without hesitation. "Forgery of federal documents. Impersonating a government official." Andrea said nothing. The officer typed something into the system, nodding. "Holding cell." It didn't matter what she said. Didn't matter what proof she had. The system was built on the assumption that she had already lost. The cuffs came off, but the red marks on her wrists remained as Cross nudged her forward, past rows of other cells filled with people who had already been swallowed whole by the machine. The door closed behind her with a dull clang. Andrea sat on the bench, her back straight, her breathing even. She wasn't waiting for justice. Justice didn't exist in places like this. But truth did. And she knew something Cross and Harper didn't. They thought they had one. That she was just another face in the system, another statistic in a report that no one would question. They had no idea who they were dealing with. From where she sat, she could hear them talking outside the cell, their voices low but not careful enough. "She had the files on her," Harper muttered. "What if?" "Doesn't matter," Cross cut him off. "We control the story. We say she was trying to pass them off as real. No one questions that." Harper hesitated. "What if someone does?" Cross let out a dry laugh. "She's nobody. The judge will believe us. They always do." Andrea's fingers curled slightly against her knee. "Nobody." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle, not out of fear, not out of anger, but something far more dangerous. She was tired. Tired of the same script, the same rehearsed performances. Tired of watching men like them walk into rooms already assuming they had one. She opened her eyes, her gaze sharp, her mind clearer than ever. They had no idea they had just buried themselves. Time passed. Minutes stretched into something longer, something unspoken. The precinct carried on with its usual rhythm, shouted orders, the clatter of paperwork, the low hum of conversations that no one was meant to overhear. Then the door at the end of the hallway opened. A different energy filled the space. Something shifted. A presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it nonetheless. Footsteps. Measured. Controlled. Then a voice. Low, steady, carrying a weight that cut through the noise around it. "She's coming with me." Andrea didn't need to look up to know who it was. Greg Langton had arrived. The room fell into an unnatural stillness as Greg Langton stepped forward, his presence shifting the air like a tide rolling in. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The weight of his reputation alone had already done half the work before he even opened his mouth. Sergeant Cross turned first, his face hardening the moment he recognized him. Harper followed a second later, shifting uncomfortably where he stood. They had expected Andrea to sit in that cell, helpless and forgotten, another name on another piece of fabricated paperwork. They hadn't expected him. Langton moved with purpose, his dark suit crisp, the kind of expensive that didn't need to be flaunted. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who had already won the fight before stepping into the ring. A leather briefcase hung from his fingers, its weight insignificant in comparison to what lay inside. He stopped at the front desk, his tone sharp but calm. "Andrea Lawson is to be released immediately." The officer behind the desk hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. His eyes flicked between Cross and Langton, caught between routine obedience and the unspoken rule that certain officers got to play by their own rules. Cross stepped forward. His jaw was set, his body angled slightly, a subconscious show of dominance. "You don't just walk in here and start making demands, Langton," he said, voice edged with forced confidence. Your client is facing federal charges. Langton didn't react immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his next words settle before he even spoke them. Really, he said at last, voice low, deliberate. Because from where I'm standing, what she's facing is false imprisonment and obstruction of justice. Harper's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He wasn't as good at masking his emotions as Cross was. His fingers twitched at his side, restless. Cross didn't flinch. We have evidence. Langton's lips curled, but it wasn't amusement. It was something sharper, something designed to cut without ever raising his voice. You have nothing. He reached into his briefcase, retrieving a thick stack of neatly bound documents. He set them down on the counter with a quiet, final sort of weight. Signed orders from the Department of Justice, he continued smoothly. Statements from federal agents confirming that Andrea Lawson was working on a classified investigation. And he reached again, pulling out another paper, this one thinner but no less damning. An internal complaint already filed against both of you for misconduct. Submitted approximately 45 minutes ago. Harper's breath hitched. He turned his head slightly toward Cross, but his superior's face remained unreadable. The officer at the desk hesitated. The balance of power was shifting. He could feel it. He tapped at his keyboard, eyes scanning the screen. His shoulders stiffened. Whatever he had just read wasn't good news for the two men standing beside him. Langton exhaled through his nose, the soft sound of quiet patience running thin. Now, he said, voice still even, are you going to unlock that door, or do I need to make some calls? Cross clenched his jaw so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. His gaze darted toward the officer at the desk, as if daring him to make a move without his approval. But the choice had already been made. A buzzer sounded. The lock on Andrea's cell clicked open. Andrea didn't move immediately. She let the silence stretch, a mirror of Langton's tactics. Then slowly she stood. She stepped forward, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. There was no relief, no visible sign that she was glad to be free. Just the same steady, calculated presence she had held from the moment this had started. She walked past Cross without sparing him a glance. Past Harper, who couldn't meet her eyes. Past the officer at the desk, who still looked like he wasn't sure if he had just ruined his own career by following orders. Langton turned on his heel, following her as she stepped out of the precinct. The sun had shifted higher in the sky, casting sharp angles across the pavement. Andrea took a slow breath in, then out, tasting the air like she was recalibrating. Langton walked beside her, silent for several steps before speaking. They underestimated you. Andrea gave a quiet, humorless laugh. They always do. They reached the black car parked at the curb. Langton moved to open the door, but Andrea paused. She turned her head slightly, gaze flicking back toward the precinct. Cross and Harper had stepped outside, watching from the entrance. Their faces were tight, unreadable, but the tension in their bodies betrayed them. She tilted her head slightly, meeting Cross's eyes for the first time since she had left the cell. The look she gave him wasn't anger. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was a promise. Then she got into the car, and the door shut behind her. The engine hummed smoothly as the car pulled away from the precinct, gliding through the city streets with the same quiet confidence as the woman sitting in the back seat. Andrea kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching the buildings blur together, the pedestrians moving through their day without a second thought. Langton sat beside her, his presence as steady as ever, though the subtle furrow in his brow suggested he was already several steps ahead, thinking through their next move. He didn't speak immediately, giving her the space to process the weight of what had just happened. Andrea wasn't rattled. She never was. But there was something electric in the air, a pulse of quiet fury buried beneath the stillness of her expression. She had expected resistance, had even expected obstacles. But what she hadn't expected, what had truly settled into the marrow of her bones, was the ease with which they had tried to erase her. They had assumed she was powerless, that no one would believe her over them, that she was just another inconvenience to be processed, dismissed, and forgotten. They had made a mistake. Langton finally exhaled, adjusting his cufflinks before speaking. We need to talk strategy. Andrea turned from the window, tilting her head slightly. This isn't over, he continued, his voice calm but firm. They're going to double down. Men like that always do. You humiliated them just by walking out of there. They won't let it go. She knew he was right. Cross and Harper weren't the type to take a loss quietly. Their kind thrived on power, and when that power was threatened, they lashed out. She could already picture the next steps they would take. Leaks to the press, false narratives woven into official reports, a desperate attempt to regain control of a story that was already slipping through their fingers. Andrea wasn't afraid of them, but she understood the game. She met Langton's gaze, her voice even. "What do we have?" He reached into his briefcase, retrieving another folder, thicker than the one he had dropped on the desk back at the precinct. "Enough to make them sweat," he said. "Financial records. Internal complaints that were buried before they reached the review board. Allegations from witnesses who were too afraid to testify." He paused, tapping his fingers against the leather cover. "It's not just these two, Andrea. This runs deeper. It always did." Andrea reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. She skimmed the names, the dates, the carefully constructed lies that had held up for years simply because no one had dared to challenge them. She had seen this before. Systemic patterns repeating themselves under different names, different jurisdictions, but always the same result. She closed the folder, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge. "We don't just need them to sweat," she murmured. "We need them to burn." Langton studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then we go to the judge. Judge Robert Hale, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. Respected, but not untouchable. He had presided over some of the most high-profile corruption cases in the last decade, but there was a difference between challenging financial fraud and going up against the very system that maintained order in a city like this. Andrea wasn't sure which side he would land on, but she was about to find out. The car turned onto a quieter street, pulling up in front of the courthouse where she should have been hours ago, if not for Cross and Harper's interference. The weight of their delay was still tangible, but it no longer mattered. They had only postponed the inevitable. She stepped out of the car, the sunlight catching against the sleek lines of her blazer. Langton followed, his briefcase steady in his grip. They walked together through the entrance, the air cooler inside, the hush of official business pressing in around them. The clerk at the front desk looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. Andrea's reputation preceded her. The woman hesitated only briefly before nodding. "He's expecting you," she said. Andrea didn't break stride. Judge Hale's office was at the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door marking the threshold between routine bureaucracy and decisions that changed the course of lives. Langton knocked once before pushing it open. The judge looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his late 50s, his hair graying at the temples, but his posture still rigid with authority. His office was neat, organized, the kind of space that suggested efficiency rather than comfort. He gestured to the chairs in front of him. "Sit." Andrea and Langton took their seats, the door clicking shut behind them. Hale folded his hands, studying them for a long moment before speaking. "I assume you're here about this morning's incident." Andrea met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here about more than that." Langton placed the folder on the desk, sliding it forward. Hale didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, considering them both. "Understand something," he said. "If you're asking me to go up against officers with a clean record, I need more than allegations." Andrea held his gaze. "Then I suggest you read." The silence stretched as the judge finally reached for the folder, flipping open the cover. His eyes moved over the documents, his expression tightening with each passing second. Langton sat still, his patience unwavering. Andrea didn't move, her pulse steady. Then Hale exhaled, closing the folder with a quiet but deliberate motion. His voice was even. "This is going to get ugly." Andrea's lips curled slightly. "It already is." Judge Hale sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the wooden surface of his desk before he steepled them together. The lines around his mouth had deepened, not with age, but with the weight of what he had just read. The file in front of him wasn't just a list of infractions. It was a carefully constructed roadmap leading straight to the heart of corruption and the men who had been foolish enough to think they were untouchable. Andrea watched him closely. She could see the wheels turning in his head, the calculations he was running. Judges like Hale didn't survive long in a system like this by acting impulsively. He had built a career on measured decisions, the kind that kept him on the right side of history without fully stepping into the fire. But now he was faced with something that left him no middle ground. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the folder before he spoke. You're asking me to go up against officers with decades of service. Officers with spotless records, at least on paper. Andrea didn't look away. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm giving you the truth. What you do with it is up to you. Langton, seated beside her, remained silent. He knew when to let the moment breathe, to allow the weight of the situation to settle before adding pressure. Hale's gaze flicked at him next. You're backing this. Langton gave a single nod. Every word in that file is documented. Every piece of evidence can be verified. The question isn't whether it's true, Judge. It's whether you're willing to let it see the light of day. The room seemed smaller somehow, the air heavier. Hale exhaled again, then reached for the folder, flipping it open once more. His eyes moved across the pages, his jaw tightening as he took in the full scope of what was in front of him. Financial inconsistencies. Witness statements that had been buried before they could make it to court. Disciplinary reports that had mysteriously vanished from official records. And at the center of it all, Cross and Harper, two men who had played the game so well they had almost gotten away with it. Almost. Hale closed the file again, his fingers drumming once against the desk before he spoke. If I move forward with this, it's not just these two. This goes higher. Andrea nodded. It always does. The judge studied her for a moment longer, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of hesitation. He found none. Finally, he leaned forward. Then let's move. Andrea didn't smile. She didn't need to. The shift had already happened. Hale reached for his intercom, pressing a button. Bring in the district attorney. Langton sat back, a slow breath escaping him. The hardest part was always the first step, the moment when the stone was finally dislodged from the mountain. The DA arrived within minutes, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent years balancing the weight of political expectations. He greeted Hale with a brief nod before his eyes flickered to Andrea and Langton. What's this about? He asked, his tone wary. Hale slid the folder across the desk. Read. The DA hesitated for only a second before reaching for it, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed the first few pages. His lips pressed into a tight line, and Andrea watched as his fingers curled slightly against the paper, his body tensing with each new revelation. This, he muttered under his breath. This is serious. Hale's expression didn't change. I'm aware. The DA flipped another page. You realize what this will mean? These officers are criminals, Andrea interrupted, her voice calm but firm. And they're not the only ones. But they're the ones who made the mistake of thinking they could put me in a cell and walk away clean. The DA glanced up at her, something unreadable in his gaze. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but even he could see the depth of what he was holding. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply and set the file down. We need to do this carefully. If we're going to take this to trial, we need an airtight case. Langton spoke for the first time in minutes. That won't be a problem. The DA studied him, then nodded. I'll start pulling the necessary motions. But if we're doing this, we need to be prepared for backlash. If we push too hard, they'll push back harder. Andrea's expression didn't waver. Then let them. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't hesitation. It was agreement. The DA rose, collecting the folder as he did. I'll start drafting the necessary paperwork. We'll make this official. Andrea nodded once. I'll be ready. Hale watched her for a long moment before finally leaning back in his chair. He looked at Langton. Make sure she is. Andrea didn't wait for the conversation to continue. She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, and turned for the door. Outside, the courthouse was as busy as ever, the world continuing as if nothing had changed. But Andrea knew better. Something had changed. And by the time this was over, Cross and Harper would realize it too. The courthouse air was thick with something unspoken. Not tension exactly, something more measured, more calculated. The kind of stillness that preceded a storm, where those who knew how the system worked could sense the shift before it fully took hold. Andrea walked through the marble-floored corridors with the same precision she carried everywhere, her heels clicking against the polished surface in steady, deliberate rhythm. She wasn't rushing, nor was she hesitating. This wasn't a victory lap. It was just the next step in a much longer game. Langton walked beside her, his presence solid, as always. He was a man accustomed to being in rooms where power was negotiated in glances and carefully worded statements. He had sat across from senators, CEOs, men and women who wielded authority like a weapon. But even he understood that what they were about to do carried a different weight. The DA had taken the file, which meant the first move had been made. It wasn't public yet, not officially, but soon it would be. And when that happened, the response wouldn't just be defensive, it would be aggressive. Cross and Harper wouldn't go down without a fight. They had built careers on the belief that they were untouchable, that the system worked for them, not against them, that the rules were malleable when applied to men like them. Andrea had seen it before. The desperate scramble of men who realized too late that they weren't as protected as they once believed. She stepped out of the courthouse, the late afternoon light casting sharp angles across the city. It was a different kind of heat now, heavier, more suffocating. Langton exhaled beside her. They're going to come at you. She didn't look at him. I know. He shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on his briefcase. Not just them. The entire precinct will close ranks. They'll make it about loyalty, about protecting their own. Andrea knew that too. They can spin whatever narrative they want, she said, her voice even. It won't change the facts. Langton let out a dry breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Facts have never been their biggest concern. Andrea turned then, finally meeting his gaze. Then they should be worried. She didn't need to say anything else. They both knew what was coming. She walked toward her car, slipping into the driver's seat without another word. Langton didn't try to stop her. He knew better. As the engine hummed to life, she let her fingers rest lightly on the steering wheel for a moment, her mind already running through the possibilities. The fight hadn't started yet, but the first shot had been fired. She drove through the city with the same controlled focus that guided everything she did. There was no rush, no reckless acceleration, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Her phone buzzed on the center console. A message. Andrea picked it up, her eyes flicking to the screen. A single line of text. They know. No name, no signature. But she didn't need one. She had been expecting this. She turned onto a quieter street, pulling into the underground parking garage of her building. The concrete walls dampened the sounds of the city above, leaving only the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The text wasn't a warning. It was a confirmation. Cross and Harper had figured it out. Andrea stepped out of the car, her movements still measured, still controlled. There was no panic, no hesitation, just the understanding that the game had entered its next phase. Inside her apartment, she set her bag down on the counter and poured herself a glass of water. They would retaliate. Of course they would. The question wasn't if, it was how. A smear campaign in the media? Possible. They had enough allies willing to push their version of events. A quiet, unofficial warning to back off? Likely. They would assume she could still be intimidated, that she had something to lose. They would try to make her the problem. Paint her as the one overstepping, the one twisting the truth. They would find ways to make her credibility the real issue, not their own corruption. Andrea took a slow sip of water, letting the thoughts settle. They would make their move soon. And when they did, she would be ready. She placed the glass down with a quiet click against the countertop, then reached for her phone again. She typed a single response. Let them come. She pressed send. And then she waited. Andrea didn't have to wait long. By the time she woke the next morning, the city had already begun whispering. The machine had started turning its wheels in the dead of night, just as she had expected. They didn't move in broad strokes, not yet. That wasn't how this worked. First came the subtle shifts, the quiet discrediting, the carefully placed seeds of doubt. The first sign was in the news. The article was buried, not headline material yet, but still placed with strategic intent. A vague accusation against an unnamed government consultant who had allegedly been caught misrepresenting her credentials. It was written just carefully enough to plant suspicion without making any direct claims, just enough to ensure that, if things escalated, people would already be primed to doubt her. She sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the article on her tablet, taking in the language, the phrasing. It was subtle, but it was there. They were coming for her. Her phone rang, breaking the silence. She didn't flinch. She reached for it, already knowing who it would be. Langton's voice came through the speaker, sharp and measured. They are moving. Andrea didn't need him to elaborate. She had already seen it. They're sloppy, she said, setting down the tablet. This wasn't planned. This was reactive. Langton exhaled through his nose, a sound of restrained frustration. They don't need it to be precise. They just need it to be loud enough. Andrea tapped her fingers lightly against the table. He was right. The truth didn't matter as much as the perception of it. If they could get enough people to question her credibility, the facts would become secondary. She stood, walking toward the window, looking out over the city. She had expected them to fight back, but the speed of their response told her something else. They were afraid. They had underestimated her once, and now they were scrambling. That meant she still had the advantage. I need to move first, she said, before they build momentum. Langton hesitated. What are you thinking? Andrea turned from the window, her mind already working through the steps. They want a smear campaign, she said. Let's give them something real to be worried about. By midday, she was in motion. She didn't go through official channels. That was the mistake people made when they thought the system still worked in their favor. No, this needed to be done carefully, directly. The first call she made was to someone who had just as much to lose as Cross and Harper. Someone who had been in the background of their schemes, benefiting from their unchecked power but never quite being in the spotlight. Someone who, if pushed correctly, wouldn't be willing to go down with them. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Mel. Controlled, but with a faint edge of tension. Andrea didn't bother with introductions. It's happening. A pause. Then a slow exhale. I saw. Then you know why I'm calling. Another pause. This one longer. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head. I can't, he said finally. You know I can't. Andrea smiled, though there was no amusement in it. You think they'll protect you? When this falls apart, do you really think they'll take the hit for you? A sharp inhale on the other end. I didn't. You did. Andrea cut in smoothly. Maybe not the way they did, but you knew. And when this goes public, that's not going to matter. The only thing that will matter is who talks first. Silence. Andrea let it stretch. Pressure was best applied in small, precise increments. Finally, the voice spoke again, quieter this time. What do you want? Andrea leaned against her desk, her voice calm. Names. Records. Anything that connects them to something bigger than this. Something they can't explain away with a PR statement. Another beat of hesitation. Then, I'll see what I can do. She nodded, knowing she had already won. You have until tomorrow. She ended the call without waiting for a response. By the evening, the storm had started to shift. More articles were surfacing now, this time with names attached. The language had evolved from vague accusations to more pointed insinuations. Internal misconduct investigations. Questions about her role in previous cases. They were trying to rewrite her history to make her seem less credible, less reliable. It wasn't unexpected, but it was clumsy. She sat at her desk, scanning the headlines, noting the outlets that had picked up the story. Some were obvious choices, those already aligned with law enforcement, always willing to defend the badge before the facts. But others were more cautious, only touching on the controversy without fully committing to a side. That was where the real battle would be fought. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. A single word. Done. She allowed herself a slow breath. The first crack had formed. Tomorrow, she would break it wide open. The morning came with a different kind of silence. Not the usual hum of a city waking up, but the charged, expectant quiet that preceded something inevitable. Andrea could feel it the moment she stepped out of bed. The pieces had been set. Now all that was left was to let them fall. She moved through her routine methodically, her mind already calculating the steps ahead. The articles had continued to spread overnight, feeding the narrative Cross and Harper were trying to construct. But she had anticipated that. What they hadn't anticipated was the counterstrike already waiting in the wings. By the time she was dressed and ready, her phone buzzed. Another message. They're sweating. She allowed herself a small, measured exhale. They should be. She didn't respond. There was no need. Everything was already in motion. At precisely 8 a.m., she walked into Langton's office. The building was a quiet fortress of polished glass and steel, a space designed for discretion and control. Inside, the tension was already thick, though no one acknowledged it out loud. Langton's secretary gave her a tight nod, barely looking up from her screen as she gestured toward the office door. Andrea stepped inside without knocking. Langton was standing near the window, phone in hand, his expression unreadable as he listened to whoever was on the other end. He glanced at her, then ended the call without another word. "They know," he said simply. Andrea set her bag down. "Of course they do." Langton turned fully to face her. "And they're panicking." She met his gaze, waiting. He exhaled, running a hand along his jaw. "They're trying to shut everything down. Calls are being made. Favors pulled. But it's too late." Andrea nodded, already knowing the answer before she even asked the question. "How bad is it?" Langton gestured toward the screen on his desk. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the latest updates. Leaked documents. Testimonies. A slow but undeniable shift in the media's tone. The outlets that had hesitated the day before were now picking up the trail, sensing that the wind was changing. More importantly, the official channels had been forced to respond. The district attorney's office had announced an internal review. The police department had issued a cautious, non-committal statement. No denials. No outright defense. Just a vague promise to assess the situation, which meant they knew exactly how deep the problem ran. She straightened, crossing her arms as she considered the next move. "When does it break fully?" Langton checked his watch. "Press conference in 2 hours." Andrea nodded again. That was the moment everything would tip. She had been in enough of these battles to know how it worked. The moment an institution was forced to acknowledge wrongdoing, the real damage control began. They would try to isolate it, contain it, frame it as an isolated incident rather than a symptom of something larger. But she had made sure they wouldn't have that option. "They'll try to throw them under the bus," Langton said, echoing her own thoughts. "Cross and Harper will be the scapegoats." Andrea tilted her head slightly. "Let them." Langton gave her a look, sharp and knowing. "That won't be enough for you." It wasn't. Cross and Harper were a problem, but they weren't the problem. They were just the most visible piece of something larger, something that had been allowed to grow unchecked for years. She moved toward the desk, picking up one of the documents, her fingers trailing over the names listed. Some she recognized, some she didn't. But all of them were complicit in one way or another. "They're going to try to stop this at the first layer," she said. "We don't let them." Langton studied her. "What's your plan?" Andrea's grip tightened slightly on the page before she set it down. "We don't let them control the narrative." By the time she arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere had changed. Cameras lined the steps. Reporters murmured among themselves, waiting for the official statement. The air buzzed with anticipation. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know how big it was yet. Andrea moved through the crowd with the same quiet certainty she carried everywhere. She wasn't here to speak. Not yet. The press conference was short. The district attorney stood before the microphones, his expression carefully neutral as he read from the prepared statement. The words were measured, designed to sound strong while revealing as little as possible. Ongoing investigation. Internal review. Commitment to justice. But the moment the first reporter raised a question, it started to unravel. Is it true that complaints against these officers were previously ignored? The DA hesitated for just a fraction too long. That was all it took. The questions came faster. What about the other officers involved? What about the department's failure to act? What about the broader implications? The DA's control over the situation slipped. And then, right when the chaos reached its peak, Andrea made her move. She stepped forward, past the reporters, past the officials trying to contain the situation. The cameras turned toward her instantly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply said, "There's more." Silence. The DA turned, his expression caught between frustration and wariness. "Ms. Lawson, this isn't." She met his gaze evenly. "You're trying to limit the damage. But this isn't something you can contain." The cameras caught every word. Cross and Harper weren't the story anymore. The system that protected them was. She could see it in the faces around her. The shift. The realization. And for the first time, she let herself feel it. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just certainty. This wasn't over. It was just beginning.